Matt Rivers had always cherished the land he had recently inherited from his late uncle. It wasn't just a piece of property, it was a slice of history, a sanctuary nestled in a quiet valley with a crystal-clear creek winding through it. The creek wasn't just a feature of the land, it was its lifeblood. It supported lush vegetation along its banks, teemed with small fish, and attracted a variety of wildlife that Matt loved observing. There were stories that the creek had once been vital to the area's early settlers, powering a gristmill and providing irrigation for nearby farms. For Matt, it was more than an old waterway, it was a connection to the past, something that made his property feel uniquely his. Moving onto the property a few months ago had been a dream come true for Matt. After years of living in cramped apartments in the city, he finally had space to breathe. The house itself was modest but comfortable, a two-bedroom structure built decades ago and surrounded by a spacious yard. What excited him most, though, was the creek. He spent his weekends clearing debris from its banks, planting native flowers, and simply enjoying the sound of the water flowing. It was his escape from the pressures of daily life, and he often thought about how lucky he was to have it all to himself. However, Matt soon realized that not everyone shared his appreciation for the creek's quiet beauty. One sunny afternoon, while trimming the hedges near the property line, he noticed his neighbor, Ted Sanders, standing by the fence, watching him intently. Ted was the kind of man who always seemed to have an opinion about everything, and most of the time, that opinion involved how other people should live their lives. Matt had met him briefly when he first moved in, and the encounter had been uncomfortable. Ted had immediately brought up property boundaries and neighborhood improvements, thinly veiled complaints about how Matt had yet to fully modernize the area around his house. "Nice little creek you've got there," Ted had said during their first meeting, leaning over the fence with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ever thought about fixing it up? Maybe making it, more useful?" Matt had laughed it off at the time, thinking Ted was just trying to make small talk. But the comment stuck with him, and now, seeing Ted loitering near the property line again, Matt couldn't shake the feeling that his neighbor had some sort of agenda. A week later, that uneasy feeling turned into outright alarm. Matt came home from work one evening to find an envelope taped to his front door. It bore the logo of the local property association, and inside was a letter informing him that his creek had been officially reclassified as a public waterway. The letter explained that this reclassification allowed for community access and enhancements, and that changes to the creek's management would be implemented for the greater good. Matt stared at the letter, trying to make sense of the bureaucratic jargon. Public waterway? His deed clearly stated that the creek was part of his private property. How could it suddenly belong to the public? He read the letter again, his frustration mounting. Buried in the text was a note that neighboring properties might have rights to request reasonable accommodations for access to the creek. One such request had already been approved. His neighbor Ted Sanders had received permission to build a fence along the creek's edge on his side to create a boundary for a planned project. It didn't take long for Matt to figure out what was happening. Ted's project was a private dock and recreational area he intended to install by the creek, which would undoubtedly disrupt its ecosystem. The idea of a fence running along the water felt like an invasion, a violation of the peace he had worked so hard to preserve. Matt was furious. He hadn't been consulted, notified, or even warned about any of this. The next morning, he marched over to the property association's office, a nondescript building in the center of town. Inside, he was greeted by a receptionist who barely glanced up from her computer as he explained his concerns. "I need to talk to someone about this creek reclassification," Matt said, holding up the letter. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked, her tone disinterested. "No, I don't have an appointment. I didn't even know this was happening until yesterday." The receptionist sighed, tapped a few keys on her keyboard, and eventually called someone to the front desk. A middle-aged man in a crisp suit appeared, introducing himself as Greg Walters, the association's legal advisor. Matt explained his situation, showing Greg the deed to his property and pointing out that the creek was clearly marked as part of his land. Greg listened patiently, his expression unreadable, before finally responding. "Well, Mr. Rivers," Greg said, "I understand your concerns, but the reclassification was done in accordance with local regulations. the creek falls under certain guidelines that allow for community access when there's potential for environmental or recreational benefit. That's ridiculous, Matt snapped. This is private property. You can't just decide it's public without my consent. Greg shrugged. You're welcome to file a formal complaint, but I should warn you, the process is lengthy, and the outcome is unlikely to change. These decisions are rarely overturned. Frustrated but unwilling to back down, Matt left the office determined to fight the reclassification. Over the next few days, he pored over every document he could find, from his property deed to local zoning laws. The more he read, the clearer it became that something wasn't right. The reclassification seemed rushed, and many of the justifications cited in the letter were vague at best. Things took a turn for the worse when construction workers arrived at the creek one morning. Matt woke to the sound of heavy machinery and looked out his window to see a team of men unloading equipment near the water. Ted was there too, barking orders and pointing toward the creek. Matt stormed outside, demanding to know what was going on. One of the workers, a burly man in a hard hat, handed him a copy of an authorization form signed by the property association. This is illegal, Matt said, his voice shaking with anger. You have no right to be here. Take it up with the association, the man replied curtly, before turning back to his work. As the workers began installing posts for the fence, Matt felt a surge of helplessness. His sanctuary, his connection to the land, was being torn apart in front of him, and it seemed like no one was on his side. But if the association thought he would roll over and let them take his creek, they were sorely mistaken. Matt resolved then and there to do whatever it took to shut this down, no matter how long it took or how hard the fight would be. The situation escalated rapidly after the construction crew began their work on the creek. Matt had spent the entire day pacing the property, his thoughts consumed by anger and disbelief. From his back porch, he could see the workers driving metal posts into the soft earth along the creek's edge. Ted Sanders was there for most of the day, overseeing the operation like a king surveying his domain. Every so often, he would glance toward Matt's house, a smug grin plastered on his face. It was as if he knew exactly how much this was infuriating Matt, and he enjoyed every second of it. That night, Matt sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by documents. He had pulled out everything he could find related to the property, the deed, the land survey, and even some old tax records his uncle had kept meticulously. His mind raced as he tried to piece together a plan. The reclassification of the creek was deeply suspicious, and Matt couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about Ted's fence. There had to be something bigger going on, something the property association wasn't telling him. As he sifted through the papers, his phone buzzed. It was a message from a neighbor, Karen, who lived a few houses down. Matt had only spoken to her a few times, but she seemed friendly and well-informed about local matters. The message read, Matt, I heard about the creek. Just so you know, you're not the first person they've done this to. The association's been pulling stunts like this for years. If you want to talk, let me know. Matt immediately called her, desperate for any information. Karen answered on the second ring, her tone cautious but supportive. I figured you'd call, she said. Look, I don't know all the details, but I've seen this before. The association has a habit of reclassifying land and then using it for community projects, but the truth is, those projects almost always benefit a few select people like Ted. What do you mean, Matt asked, gripping the phone tightly. There was a family on the other side of the neighborhood a few years ago. They had a small pond on their property. The association claimed it was a public resource and forced them to allow access. Not long after, a developer came in and built a park around it. The family tried to fight it, but they didn't stand a chance. The association had all the paperwork in order, and the courts sided with them. The family ended up selling their house and leaving. Matt felt a chill run down his spine. So you're saying this could be part of a bigger plan? It wouldn't surprise me, Karen replied. Ted's been pushing for more amenities in the neighborhood for years. He's on good terms with the head of the association, and he has connections with developers. If I were you, I'd start looking into who stands to gain from all this. After the call, Matt sat in silence, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. Karen's story made too much sense to ignore. This wasn't just about a fence or a reclassification, it was about money and power. The creek, with its pristine water and natural beauty, was a valuable asset, and Matt suspected the association wanted to control it for their own gain. The next morning, Matt decided to confront the property association directly. He called their office and demanded a meeting with someone who could explain the reclassification. After being put on hold for what felt like an eternity, he was finally connected to Greg Walters, the same legal advisor he had spoken to earlier. "I need answers," Matt said, his voice firm. "Why was my creek reclassified without my consent? And how did Ted get approval to build a fence on my property?" Greg sighed, as if Matt were an annoyance he had to tolerate. "Mr. Rivers, as I explained before, the reclassification was conducted in accordance with local regulations. As for the fence, it's being constructed on Mr. Sanders' property, not yours. The association granted him permission because the creek is now considered a public waterway, which allows for reasonable accommodations." "Reasonable accommodations," Matt repeated, his frustration boiling over. "You call a private dock and a fence that cuts off access to my property reasonable?" "I understand your concerns," Greg said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "If you'd like to file a formal complaint, you're welcome to do so. But I should warn you, the process is extensive, and the outcome is unlikely to change." Matt clenched his fists, his anger barely contained. "You can't just take my land and give it away. I'll fight this." "You're welcome to try," Greg replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "But I assure you, the association has followed all proper procedures. Good luck, Mr. Rivers." The call ended, leaving Matt seething. It was clear that the property association had no intention of backing down, and they likely had the legal resources to drag out any dispute for months, if not years. But Matt wasn't about to let them steamroll him. If they wanted a fight, he would give them one. Later that day, Matt decided to visit the creek again to assess the damage. To his horror, he discovered that the construction crew had made significant progress. The fence posts were now fully installed, and the workers were preparing to attach the panels. Even worse, there was a pile of concrete blocks and lumber near the water, likely for the dock Ted had planned. As Matt stood there, trying to contain his rage, Ted appeared, casually strolling down to the creek as if he owned the place. "Morning," Ted said with a smirk. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Matt glared at him. "You've got some nerve. This is my land, my creek, and you have no right to be here." Ted chuckled. "Your creek? You're behind the times, my friend. The association made it public, remember? I'm just making it a little more accessible." "This isn't over," Matt said, his voice low and steady. "I'll make sure you and the association pay for this." Ted's smirk widened. "Oh, I'm sure you'll try. But good luck going up against the association. They've got lawyers, Matt. What do you have?" Matt didn't respond. He turned and walked back to his house, his mind racing. Ted was right about one thing: Matt was outmatched, at least for now, but he wasn't about to give up. That evening, Matt began making phone calls. He reached out to environmental organizations, land use attorneys, and even a historian who specialized in local waterways. He needed allies, people who could help him build a case against the association. If this was going to be a fight, he couldn't do it alone. As the sun set, Matt stood by the creek, watching the water flow past the partially constructed fence. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, this place had been his sanctuary. Now it was a battleground. But Matt wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. He would find a way to stop this, no matter what it took. Matt's frustration had reached a boiling point. For days, he had been trying to piece together the full extent of what the association was planning, but it felt like every door he knocked on was slammed in his face. The construction along the creek was moving at an alarming pace. Ted Sanders, with his smug, overbearing presence, seemed to be relishing every moment of Matt's discomfort. But Matt wasn't about to roll over. If the association and Ted thought they could bully him into submission, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. His first step was to bring in professional help. Early one morning, Matt contacted a surveyor to reassess the boundaries of his property. He needed clear, undeniable proof that the association and Ted had crossed the line, both literally and legally. The surveyor, a middle-aged man named Scott Grant, arrived later that afternoon with a clipboard, measuring tools, and a determined look. "You've got quite the mess on your hands," Scott said as he stepped out of his truck and surveyed the creek. The fence posts were now fully installed, their harsh, angular lines clashing with the natural beauty of the area. A few workers were still milling about, unloading materials for what Matt assumed would become Ted's private dock. "That's putting it lightly," Matt muttered. "Can you tell me if this fence is on my property or not?" Scott nodded. "That's what I'm here for. Let's get started." For the next few hours, Matt followed Scott as he measured and marked the property lines. Ted, predictably, appeared halfway through the process, strutting down to the creek with an exaggerated air of authority. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Ted said, his voice dripping with faux politeness. "What's all this?" Having second thoughts about the creek, Matt ignored him, focusing on Scott's work. But Scott, clearly unimpressed by Ted's theatrics, straightened up and gave him a cold stare. "We're just making sure everything's in order. Nothing for you to worry about." Ted chuckled. "Oh, I'm not worried. Just curious. With all this fuss Matt's been kicking up, you'd think he'd have better things to do." "Like letting you destroy my property," Matt shot back, his patience wearing thin. "Property," Ted smirked. "I think you'll find the association has already settled that debate. But hey, by all means keep wasting your time. It's entertaining." With that, Ted sauntered off, leaving Matt seething. Scott, sensing his frustration, patted him on the shoulder. "Don't let him get to you. Guys like that thrive on attention. Let's finish up here." By the end of the day, Scott had his results. He rolled out a detailed map on Matt's kitchen table and pointed to the creek. "Based on my measurements, the fence encroaches on your property by about 5 feet in several places, and this," he tapped on the area marked where the dock was being constructed, "is entirely on your land. No question about it." Matt felt a flicker of hope. "So they're breaking the law?" Scott shrugged. "Technically, yes, but proving it in court is another matter. You'll need more than my measurements to make a solid case. I suggest getting a lawyer involved." Matt thanked Scott for his help and immediately called his attorney, Lauren Brooks. Lauren was sharp, experienced, and had dealt with property disputes before. When Matt explained the situation, she didn't mince words. "This is bad, Matt," she said. "The association is clearly overstepping, but they're banking on the fact that you don't have the resources to fight them. It's a common tactic. They push just far enough to make you angry, but not far enough to make it easy for you to sue." "So what do I do?" Matt asked, gripping the phone. "You gather evidence," Lauren replied. "Get photos, documents, anything that proves they've crossed the line. And don't engage with Ted or the workers directly. They'll try to bait you into doing something that makes you look bad. Stay calm, stay focused, and let me handle the legal side of things." The next few days were a blur of activity. Matt documented everything: the fence, the dock construction, and even the workers' trucks parked suspiciously close to his property line. He sent the photos and videos to Lauren, who began building a case. But even as he worked tirelessly to protect his land, Matt couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. One evening, as he was photographing the fence, he noticed a car parked at the far end of the road. Its headlights were off, but he could see the faint glow of a phone screen inside. The car stayed there for nearly an hour before driving off. The next morning, he found a small pile of debris, sticks, leaves, and dirt dumped in his driveway. It was a petty, childish act, but it unnerved him nonetheless. Matt suspected Ted was behind it, but he had no proof. Instead of reacting, he channeled his frustration into action. He reached out to a local environmental organization, hoping they might be interested in the ecological impact of the construction. To his relief, they agreed to send an expert to assess the situation. When the environmental expert, Dr. Emily Harris, arrived, she wasted no time getting to work. She inspected the creek, took water samples, and examined the area around the fence. By the end of the day, she had some damning findings. "The construction is causing significant disruption to the creek's ecosystem," she explained as Matt walked her back to her car. They've altered the flow of water, which is already impacting the vegetation and wildlife. If this continues, it could have long-term consequences. Can you use this information to stop them? Matt asked, desperate for a breakthrough. I can file a report with the state environmental agency, Dr. Harris replied. It might not stop them immediately, but it will put pressure on the association. They'll have to address these violations sooner or later. It wasn't the decisive victory Matt had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. That evening, he sent Dr. Harris's preliminary findings to Lauren, who assured him that it would strengthen their case. But as Matt prepared for the next phase of the fight, the association made their next move. A letter arrived in the mail, notifying him of a formal complaint filed against him. The complaint alleged that Matt had obstructed community improvements and engaged in disruptive behavior that interfered with the association's work. It was a blatant attempt to discredit him, and Matt knew it. But as he read the letter, a new sense of determination took hold. They were trying to paint him as the villain, but he wouldn't let them win. That night, Matt stood by the creek, watching the moonlight dance on the water. The fence loomed in the distance, a harsh reminder of what he was fighting for. He didn't know how long this battle would last, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. Matt's fight for his creek had reached a fever pitch. Over the past few weeks, he had thrown himself into building his case, gathering every piece of evidence he could find to prove the association had overstepped their authority. With the help of Lauren, his lawyer, and Dr. Emily Harris, the environmental expert, Matt felt like he was finally starting to gain ground. But as he would soon learn, the association wasn't just sitting idly by. They were preparing their own moves, and Matt would have to navigate an increasingly complex web of deception, manipulation, and power plays. The first sign of escalation came in the form of a meeting notice. Matt found the flyer taped to his mailbox one morning, its bold lettering announcing a special community meeting to address the ongoing dispute over the creek. The meeting was set to take place in just 3 days at the local community center, and the flyer made it clear that the association intended to use the event to rally support for their side. "This isn't good," Lauren said when Matt showed her the flyer during a call later that day. "They're trying to turn the community against you. If they can paint you as the problem, it'll make it harder for us to push back legally. Public opinion doesn't decide court cases, but it can influence how aggressively the association pursues this." "What should I do?" Matt asked. "You'll need to go to the meeting," Lauren said. "Stay calm, be prepared to explain your side of the story, and focus on the facts. Don't let them bait you into an emotional reaction. And whatever you do, don't go alone. Bring someone who can back you up." Matt thought about who he could bring. Karen had been helpful so far, but he didn't want to put her in an uncomfortable position. Instead, he reached out to Dr. Harris, who agreed to attend the meeting and speak about the environmental impact of the construction. Having an expert on his side would lend credibility to his arguments, and Matt hoped it would be enough to counter whatever the association had planned. The night of the meeting arrived quickly. The community center was packed, with nearly every seat filled by neighbors, association board members, and a few people Matt didn't recognize. At the front of the room, a long table was set up for the board, with Greg Walters sitting squarely in the center, flanked by other members of the association. Ted Sanders sat in the audience, a smug expression on his face as he chatted with a few neighbors. Matt and Dr. Harris took seats near the back, quietly observing as the meeting began. Greg stood and addressed the room, his tone polished and authoritative. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began. "As many of you know, there has been some controversy surrounding the reclassification of the creek that runs through Mr. Rivers' property. We understand that this is a sensitive issue, and we want to ensure that the community is fully informed about why this decision was made and how it benefits everyone." Matt's jaw tightened as Greg launched into a carefully crafted speech about the association's commitment to preserving natural resources and enhancing community access. He spoke about the creek as if it had always been a neglected, forgotten feature of the neighborhood, conveniently omitting the fact that Matt had spent months restoring it. When Greg finished, he opened the floor for comments, and Ted was the first to speak. "Look, no one here wants to cause trouble," Ted said, his voice dripping with false modesty. "But the fact is, this creek has been underutilized for years. What the association is doing isn't just legal, it's necessary. We're turning a stagnant resource into something the whole community can enjoy. I think it's time for certain people," he glanced pointedly at Matt, "to stop standing in the way of progress." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, and Matt felt his frustration boiling over. But before he could respond, Dr. Harris stood and raised her hand. Greg nodded for her to speak, though his expression suggested he wasn't thrilled about it. "My name is Dr. Emily Harris," she began, her voice steady and confident. "I'm an environmental scientist, and I've been studying the impact of the construction on the creek. While I understand the desire to improve community resources, the methods being used here are causing significant harm. The construction has disrupted the natural flow of water, damaged the vegetation along the banks, and introduced contaminants into the ecosystem. If this continues, the creek could lose much of its ecological value, which would harm not just the environment but the community as well." The room fell silent as Dr. Harris laid out her findings, using clear, irrefutable evidence to counter the association's claims. Matt could see several people in the audience nodding along, their expressions shifting from skepticism to concern. Even Ted's smirk faltered slightly. But Greg wasn't about to let the momentum shift entirely. When Dr. Harris finished, he stood again and addressed the room. "Thank you for your input, Dr. Harris," he said smoothly. "We appreciate your expertise. However, I'd like to point out that the association has conducted its own assessments, and we believe the benefits of this project far outweigh the temporary disruptions. We are working with qualified professionals to ensure that any environmental impact is minimized." "That's a lie," Matt said, unable to stay silent any longer. All eyes turned to him as he stood, his voice firm but controlled. "You haven't conducted any real assessments. You're destroying the creek for your own gain, and you're doing it without my consent. This isn't about community benefits, it's about money." Greg raised an eyebrow. "Do you have proof of these accusations, Mr. Rivers?" "I have proof that your fence and dock are on my property," Matt shot back. "And I have proof that the reclassification was pushed through without following proper procedures. You've been lying to everyone here and you know it." The tension in the room was palpable as Greg and Matt locked eyes. For a moment it seemed like Greg might lose his composure, but he quickly recovered, flashing a tight smile. "If you have concerns, Mr. Rivers, I suggest you take them up with the appropriate channels. This meeting is about the community, not your personal grievances." The meeting eventually ended without a clear resolution, but Matt felt a small sense of victory. Dr. Harris's testimony had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the neighbors, and several people approached him afterward to express their support. It wasn't enough to stop the construction outright, but it was a start. As Matt and Dr. Harris left the community center, he couldn't shake the feeling that the association wasn't done with him yet. They had too much at stake to back down now, and he knew they would come at him harder than ever. But for the first time, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. With Dr. Harris, Lauren, and a growing number of supportive neighbors on his side, Matt was determined to see this battle through to the end, no matter what it took. The days following the community meeting were tense, and Matt felt the pressure mounting. While Dr. Harris's testimony had swayed some of the neighbors, it was clear that the association wasn't slowing down. Construction along the creek continued at a relentless pace. The fence was nearly finished, and workers had begun laying the foundation for Ted Sanders' dock. To make matters worse, Matt began noticing subtle, deliberate acts of intimidation. One morning, he found a notice taped to his front door. It was an official-looking document from the local zoning office, claiming that his property was under investigation for unauthorized modifications to a natural waterway. Matt's frustration boiled over. He hadn't modified the creek in any way, if anything. It was the association and Ted who were responsible for the disruptions. He called Lauren immediately. "This is getting out of hand," he said, pacing his living room as he explained the notice. "Now they're trying to pin violations on me." "It's a scare tactic," Lauren replied, her voice calm but firm. "They want to rattle you, make you feel like you're on the defensive. The good news is, if this is a formal investigation, it gives us a chance to bring their activities under scrutiny too. I'll contact the zoning office and request a copy of their complaint. If the association filed this, they'll have to back it up with evidence. Matt felt a glimmer of relief at Lauren's confidence, but the harassment didn't stop there. That same afternoon, as he walked down to the creek to document the construction, he noticed a drone hovering above his property. It buzzed loudly, circling over his yard and the creek before zipping off toward Ted's house. By the time Matt made it back to his porch, he saw Ted standing in his driveway, arms crossed and a smug expression plastered across his face. "Nice day for a walk, isn't it?" Ted called out. Matt ignored him, his jaw tightening as he turned to head inside. "Don't worry about the drone," Ted added, his voice thick with mock reassurance. "Just making sure everything's up to code. You wouldn't want the zoning office to find anything out of place, would you?" Matt stopped in his tracks, clenching his fists. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to take a deep breath and keep walking. Ted was trying to bait him, and Matt wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. That evening, Matt met with Dr. Harris to discuss the ongoing environmental impact of the construction. They reviewed the latest water samples, which showed increased levels of sediment and pollutants. Dr. Harris explained that the disturbances to the creek's flow were causing erosion along the banks, which could have long-term consequences for the surrounding ecosystem. "This isn't just about the creek," Dr. Harris said. "If they keep this up, it could affect the water table and the vegetation on your property. You're not just fighting for the creek, you're fighting to protect your land as a whole." Matt nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we need to escalate this. What's the next step?" Dr. Harris hesitated for a moment before replying. "I can file a formal complaint with the state environmental agency. It'll take time for them to investigate, but once they do, the association will have to halt construction until the review is complete. It's not a permanent solution, but it could buy us some breathing room." Matt agreed, and the next morning Dr. Harris submitted the complaint. Meanwhile, Lauren worked to uncover the details of the zoning investigation. She discovered that the complaint against Matt had indeed been filed by the association, using vague claims of unauthorized landscaping as justification. Lauren wasted no time drafting a counter-complaint, accusing the association of illegal land use and submitting false reports to local authorities. But as Matt and his team fought back, the association doubled down on their efforts. A few days later, Matt returned home to find that the water in the creek had dropped significantly. It wasn't just a seasonal change, the flow had been deliberately restricted. Alarmed, Matt followed the creek upstream, where he discovered a small makeshift dam blocking the water. The dam was crudely constructed with rocks, sandbags, and wooden planks, but it was effective enough to divert most of the water into a pipe that ran toward Ted's property. Matt's stomach churned as he realized what was happening. Ted had built an irrigation system to siphon water from the creek for his dock and whatever other projects he had planned. Furious, Matt took photos of the dam and the pipe before calling Lauren. "This has to be illegal," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "They're stealing water from the creek." "It is illegal," Lauren confirmed. "But proving it will require more than just photos. We'll need to trace the source of the pipe and show that it's connected to Ted's property. Do you have anyone who can help with that?" Matt thought for a moment before calling Dr. Harris. She agreed to meet him at the dam the next day to inspect the site and document the damage. When they arrived, Dr. Harris immediately began taking notes and collecting samples. "This is worse than I thought," she said, examining the pipe. "If they're diverting this much water, it could have serious consequences for the entire watershed." They followed the pipe as far as they could, but it disappeared underground before reaching Ted's property. Dr. Harris suggested bringing in a hydrologist to map the underground system and provide expert testimony if the case went to court. As they discussed their next steps, Matt noticed a truck parked near the dam. Two men in work uniforms climbed out, carrying shovels and other tools. When they saw Matt and Dr. Harris, they stopped in their tracks, clearly surprised to find anyone there. "This is private property," Matt called out, his voice firm. "What are you doing here?" The men exchanged a glance before one of them spoke. "We're just here to do some maintenance work. No big deal." "Maintenance on a dam that's blocking my creek," Matt snapped. "Who sent you?" The men didn't answer. Instead, they quickly climbed back into their truck and drove off, leaving Matt and Dr. Harris standing by the dam. "This isn't just Ted," Dr. Harris said quietly. "There's someone else involved, someone with resources and influence. You're up against more than just the association." Matt felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made the situation feel even more daunting. Whoever was behind this clearly wasn't afraid to break the rules to get what they wanted. Later that evening, Matt received a call from Karen. She had heard about the dam and wanted to warn him about something she had overheard at a neighborhood gathering. "I think Ted's working with a developer," Karen said. "There's been talk about turning the creek into a commercial property, maybe a small marina or something like that. If that's true, they'll stop at nothing to push you out." Matt's grip tightened on the phone. "Thanks for letting me know, Karen. I'll take care of it." But even as he said the words, he knew the battle was far from over. The association, Ted, and whoever was backing them were playing a long game, and Matt would need to dig deeper if he wanted to expose the full extent of their scheme. As the night fell, Matt stood by the creek, staring at the damaged waterway. The stakes were higher than ever, but he wasn't going to give up. If they wanted a war, they'd get one. And Matt was determined to win. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than Matt had anticipated. After weeks of documenting every violation, every disruption to the creek, and every instance of intimidation, Lauren informed him that their case was ready to move forward. The environmental agency had launched an investigation into the complaints filed by Dr. Harris, and a court hearing was scheduled to address both the zoning disputes and Matt's claim that the association had overstepped its authority by reclassifying the creek. For Matt, this was the moment he had been fighting for, but it also carried enormous risks. If the court ruled against him, it could mean the permanent loss of control over his property and the creek he had worked so hard to protect. On the morning of the hearing, Matt arrived at the courthouse armed with evidence, photos, videos, environmental reports, and a comprehensive analysis from the hydrologist Dr. Harris had recommended. Lauren had prepared meticulously, compiling a legal argument that exposed the association's overreach, Ted's illegal water diversion, and the environmental damage caused by the construction. Dr. Harris accompanied Matt, ready to provide expert testimony if needed. The courtroom was packed. Several neighbors had shown up, some to support Matt and others, it seemed, out of morbid curiosity. At the front of the room sat Greg Walters, the association's legal advisor, flanked by two other board members. Ted was there too, sitting smugly with his arms crossed. His presence was a stark reminder that this fight wasn't just about legal arguments, it was personal. The proceedings began with opening statements. Greg wasted no time framing the association as a benevolent organization working for the betterment of the community. He argued that the reclassification of the creek was done in full compliance with local laws and claimed that Matt was being unreasonable and obstructive in his refusal to cooperate. When it was Lauren's turn, she dismantled Greg's narrative piece by piece. She presented evidence showing that the reclassification process had been rushed, with several procedural violations along the way. She highlighted the association's failure to consult Matt or notify him of the changes before they were finalized. Then, she moved on to the more damning evidence, the illegal dam and water diversion system that Ted had installed. "Your Honor," Lauren said, addressing the judge, "what we're seeing here is a blatant abuse of power. The association reclassified this creek not for the community's benefit, but to facilitate private projects like Mr. Sanders' dock. This is not just a property dispute, it's an environmental issue with far-reaching consequences." Dr. Harris took the stand next, delivering a scathing assessment of the damage caused by the construction. She explained how the dam and water diversion had disrupted the creek's natural flow, leading to erosion, reduced water quality, and harm to local wildlife. Her testimony was clear, concise, and backed by hard data. Throughout her testimony, Matt watched as Greg scribbled notes furiously, his polished confidence beginning to falter. Even Ted's smug demeanor seemed to crack, though he tried to maintain his composure. The turning point came when Lauren introduced a document she had obtained through a public records request. It was a set of meeting minutes from a private session held by the association months before the reclassification was announced. The minutes revealed that the reclassification was part of a broader plan to attract commercial developers to the area. Ted had been listed as a key advocate for the project, and his dock was described as a prototype for potential future developments. This document, Lauren said, holding it up for the court to see, proves that the association acted in bad faith. They had no intention of preserving this creek as a public resource. Their goal was profit, plain and simple. Greg attempted to object, claiming the document had been taken out of context, but the damage was done. The judge requested time to review the evidence, and the courtroom fell into a tense silence as everyone waited for the ruling. When the judge finally returned, his decision was swift and decisive, based on the evidence presented. The judge began, "It is clear that the association failed to follow proper procedures in reclassifying the creek. Furthermore, the construction activities conducted by Mr. Sanders and the association have caused significant environmental harm, in violation of state regulations. I am ordering an immediate halt to all construction along the creek and the removal of the dam and dock infrastructure. The creek's status as private property is hereby reinstated, and the association is prohibited from making any further claims to it without explicit legal justification." A ripple of relief swept through Matt as the judge's words sank in. He had done it, he had won. Ted's face turned red with anger, and Greg looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. But the judge wasn't finished. In addition, he continued, "The association is fined for its environmental violations, and a formal investigation into their activities will be conducted by the state. Mr. Sanders is personally ordered to pay restitution to Mr. Rivers for damages caused by the illegal water diversion and unauthorized construction on his property." Ted shot out of his seat, sputtering protests, but the judge silenced him with a sharp glare. "This court will not tolerate such blatant disregard for property rights and environmental laws," the judge said firmly. As the hearing concluded, Matt felt a wave of emotions: relief, pride, and exhaustion all at once. His neighbors approached him as he left the courtroom, many of them offering congratulations and apologizing for doubting him. Dr. Harris shook his hand and promised to keep monitoring the creek to ensure it recovered fully. For the first time in weeks, Matt allowed himself to breathe. The fight had been long and grueling, but he had stood his ground and prevailed. The creek was his again, and the association had been exposed for what it truly was. Outside the courthouse, Matt paused to look up at the clear blue sky. He thought of his uncle, who had left him this land and the responsibility that came with it. He had fought not just for the creek, but for the principle that no one should have the right to take away what's yours. As he drove home, passing the familiar bends and curves of the valley, Matt felt a renewed sense of purpose. The creek, once a symbol of tranquility, had become a battleground, but now it was a symbol of resilience and justice. He wasn't just protecting a piece of land, he was standing up for himself and for everything he believed in. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew he would be ready. The weeks following the court's decision brought a mix of relief and quiet reflection for Matt. The constant noise of construction along the creek had been replaced by the gentle sound of flowing water. The workers were gone, the fence was dismantled, and the makeshift dam upstream had been removed under strict orders from the court. For the first time in months, the creek was truly his again, its natural beauty slowly returning as the ecosystem began to recover. Ted Sanders, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen. Word around the neighborhood was that he had quietly put his house up for sale and moved out of the area. His plans for the dock and private access to the creek were in ruins, along with his reputation. The association, once a powerful and domineering force in the neighborhood, had also been severely weakened. Their fines and legal troubles had drained their resources, and several board members, including Greg Walters, had resigned under pressure. The remaining members of the association reached out to Matt, extending an olive branch of sorts. They proposed a complete overhaul of the organization, promising more transparency and fairness moving forward. Matt, wary of their motives, agreed to meet with them but made it clear that he would not tolerate any further interference with his property. To his surprise, they seemed genuinely contrite, and he saw an opportunity to ensure that the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. "I don't want to fight with my neighbors," Matt told the group during their meeting. "But I won't hesitate to defend what's mine if it comes to that again. If you're serious about change, I'll support it, but you need to prove it. Over the next few weeks, the association began drafting new bylaws that prioritized property rights and environmental protection. Matt took a seat on the advisory committee, ensuring that the lessons from his battle wouldn't be forgotten. His involvement brought a sense of cautious optimism to the neighborhood, and many residents began to see him not as a troublemaker, but as someone who had stood up for fairness and justice. As for the creek, it became a symbol of resilience, both for Matt and the community. With the help of Dr. Harris, he organized a restoration project to repair the damage caused by the construction. Volunteers from the neighborhood joined in, planting native grasses and wildflowers along the banks and removing debris from the water. The effort brought people together in a way that felt genuine and meaningful, and for the first time, Matt felt a sense of connection to the community he had fought so hard to protect. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Matt stood by the creek, watching the water shimmer in the fading light. The area around him had transformed into a thriving haven for wildlife once more, with frogs croaking softly and birds darting between the trees. He felt a deep sense of pride, not just for winning the battle, but for what the fight had taught him about perseverance, courage, and the importance of standing up for what's right. His uncle's old house, once a quiet retreat, had become a place of purpose and renewal. Matt no longer saw the creek as just a personal sanctuary. It was a reminder of everything he had fought for, not just the land, but the principle that no one had the right to take away what was his. As he turned to head back inside, he noticed Karen walking down the road toward his property, carrying a small basket of muffins. "Thought you might like these," she said with a smile. "You've done a lot for this neighborhood, Matt. It's nice to see the creek looking like it should again." Matt accepted the basket with a nod of thanks, a warm feeling spreading through him. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt truly at home. The fight for the creek had been hard, but it had also brought unexpected rewards, new connections, a stronger sense of community, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to protect what mattered most. As Matt closed the door behind him, the sound of the creek flowing in the background, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready. He had already proven to himself and everyone else that when it came to standing his ground, he wouldn't back down.